Hey there, and welcome to my tutorial about the multiply blending mode. We're gonna take a detailed look at how it actually works, which I will visualize through self-made interactive graphs. And after that I'll show you how you can use it for your artworks, photo editing and more. It is useful for darkening things, like adding shadows or vignettes, but also for adding some colors or shifting them. However, like most blending modes, it is strongly tied to the RGB values, and so if you are not careful, you can get some crazy unwanted results. This is part of a long series of tutorials where I explain every single default blending mode that you can find in Photoshop and many other graphics programs. So, if you want to learn more about the others, check out the playlist and subscribe. Alright, enough self-promotion now. Let us start with this graph here. To quickly explain how it works, on the bottom axis we have a gradient of colors, which are going to be our base colors. With that I mean all the colors underneath the blending layer. And on the vertical axis we have the blending colors, so all the colors on said blending layer. This current graph shows us colors according to the HSV parameters, so hue, saturation and value. I will also show you graphs that use the HSL and HCL color spaces. If you want to learn more about those and many other color spaces like CMYK, RGB and so on, you can check out my other video that explains all of them in high detail. Now what this graph does is, it takes colors from the two axes that go from 0 to 100% value and blends them together, just like they would get blended together in your graphics program. And these curves, in this case, show us what specific values are along these contour lines. So all the colors that cross this line that says 0.6 for example have a value of about 60%. We can use these lines to read how the value changes. The interactive part is the sliders up here, where I can control all the other parameters, so hue and saturation in this case. Let us start by going for fully saturated red on both sides, because this shows how the pure red channel of the RGB colors gets changed. You see, almost all blending modes work in a way that they do certain calculations for the red, green and blue colors individually. In the case of multiply, it does exactly what it says. It multiplies the two reds together and creates a new red. Now you might think, well, if you multiply something, wouldn't it become larger, therefore brighter? Well, that is not the case if you use numbers between 0 and 1, which is what we do here. The result is always smaller, therefore the darkening effect. I promise you that I won't be that much more math. I just want to shortly mention how it actually works behind the scenes. You don't need to learn this mathematical stuff to be able to work with it, but it can be interesting to know. Now then, if we take a look at the contour lines, we can already see that there is a general darkening effect. If the lines would be perfectly straight, giving us repeating square shapes, then there would be no change. However, here they are bending towards the upper right corner, the brightest corner, therefore expanding the darker areas. And more dark areas means an overall darkening effect. There are special cases though. If you have 0, so just black, then everything ends up as black, because if you multiply by 0, you get 0. And if you have 1 on one side, so the bright red, then the other side will remain unchanged. That's what happens when you multiply by 1. And that is why if you use white with this blending mode, then it won't do anything, because white has 100% for all RGB values. By the way, multiply is a symmetrical blending mode, which means that you could switch whatever is the base and blending color and you would still get the same result. This is not the case for all blending modes, so do not take this for granted for all of them. Alright, I only chose the HSV value graph as the first one to demonstrate how the individual RGB channels get changed. Let's switch over to the HSL Lightness, because this one shows the full spectrum between black and white. Now if I use the same settings again as before, then we get this. Quite different looking now. So the lower left quarter is the same as we had before in the HSV value. The upper right one has the exact same curve shapes, so we know that if we combine two brighter reds, there is also some darkening. However, there are straight lines in the other quarters. If you try to mix a bright red above 50% lightness with one below 50%, then the darker one will be dominant and remain unchanged. That has to do with the RGB values. If you increase a red from 0 to 50%, then you only increase the red value. However, at 50% lightness, you already have the maximum amount of red. In order to move closer to white, you add green and blue. Now when you combine both of those cases and multiply them, the darker red will eliminate the green and blue values since you multiply by 0. And at the same time, the brighter red has red at 1. So overall we are left with the darker red we started with. I won't explain the RGB math in detail like this all the time. I just want to demonstrate to you that multiply doesn't just make colors darker and that's it. The RGB values play an important role. As you just saw, there could be no darkening whatsoever in some cases, and other things like the hue and saturation get also wildly shifted. But we'll get to that soon. Alright, now let's finally mix some other colors together. Firstly, let's change the hue. You see that the colors in the upper part of the graph are changing, but the curves aren't budging. Well, until we reach a certain point, which is 1/6 of the hue spectrum. Then the curves start bending towards the upper right corner. And remember, the more they bend towards that corner, the more the general lightness drops. When we reach 1/3 of the way, the darkening effect has gotten to its peak. Along the middle of the curves we have these corners now. If we keep moving, they get a bit more smoothened, and at the midway point the same thing happens, but just in reverse. So we had these specific points where the curve's behavior changed, at 1/6, 1/3 and 1/2. You might have guessed it at this point, yes, it has to do with the RGB values again. The hue colors are actually defined as specific RGB values that cycle through each other, where one is always at maximum and one is always 0. The reason why the curves don't change during the first sixth is because the red values are still at 100% for both colors. Only after that sixth the red values start shrinking together with the lightness. And these points are actually more important than the relative difference between the hues. With that I mean, if we take 0.1 as the hue value, then the curves will look a bit different. However, the specific points from earlier still dictate where the behavior changes. Despite that, we can still say that the lightness generally is even lower when the hues are far apart. This is important to know if you're using one specific color for doing some shading, for example, and you paint over several colors with different hues. Some of those colors will get more darkened than others simply based on that hue difference. Okay, we haven't touched the saturation sliders yet. What kind of effect do those have? Well, a lower saturation basically just moves the curves closer to the state we saw earlier. The lower the saturation, for both, the closer the curves will get to the default point and will overall change less. Therefore, if we use very lowly saturated colors, the darkening effect will be more consistent. If you do shading with a color that is close to gray, you don't have to worry about the hues. Okay, let's move on to the hue graph. This one is gonna get especially funky. Now here in this case, the curves stand for specific hues. 0.5 for example stands for cyan, 0.8 for magenta, and so on. We're going to look at how those hues get shifted as you combine two different hues with different saturations and values. First of all, changing the lightness while below 50% doesn't change anything. Only when it's above 50% the curves start to move. To be more precise, they start converging towards these straight lines. Because after all, blending with white means no change for the other color. The same happens when the saturation is at 0 for one of them, then we get straight lines. Makes sense, because we're just blending with gray, so we're just making an already existing hue darker. Now as we increase the saturation again slowly, we can see this wavy pattern forming. If we look at cyan for example, when it gets mixed with cyan, then there is obviously no shift in hue. But if it gets mixed with purple for example, then it shifts towards blue, and more towards green in the other direction. At the red point, which is the exact opposite hue, there is no hue shift again. And as I increase the saturation, these shifts will get stronger and stronger. However, as the saturations get closer to being equal, something weird is happening. We get this stripy pattern with very vibrant red, green and blue areas and muddy looking in-between ridges. Similar patterns occur for other saturations when they are equal. When we crank both saturations up to maximum, then we mostly have red, green, blue and black left, with some very small spots for yellow, cyan and magenta. Another one of those RGB effects. The hues aren't just shifting, but for very high saturations, the dominant RGB values start to override everything. However, if not both saturations are at maximum, but only one of them, then you can still somewhat work with this. Our conclusion from this graph: try to avoid blending two very highly saturated colors together, since the result can be very unpredictable. In general, the hue shifts can get a bit weird at times, so look closely how your colors get changed and make adjustments if your results got shifted too strongly. Okay, next up we're going to take a closer look at how the saturation gets shifted. Gonna start off with blending the same hue at 50% lightness. Now here in this case we have curves that are bent towards the lower left corner. Higher saturations take up more space that way, so therefore the saturation is increasing. And we have the same behavior as before, where during the first sixth of the hue shift there is no change. But after that point the curves start wandering towards the upper right corner, so the increase in saturation gets lowered. When it reaches the 1/3 point, we get these perfectly straight box shapes, which means that we always get the higher saturation of the two without change. And by going further towards the middle point, so to the opposite hue, then the saturation drastically decreases. Along the diagonal here we only have grays now. And going beyond the middle point just shows everything in reverse. Another very important conclusion that we can draw from this: the saturation also gets strongly influenced by this blending mode. If you have hues that are close to each other, the saturation increases, but mixing opposite hues makes the result far less colorful. The lightness behaves pretty much the same way as with the hue graph. Below 50% nothing changes, but above 50% we have this smoothening effect again. So if you use a rather bright color, then the shift in saturation will be much more subtle, regardless of what hues you combine. Also something to keep in mind. Sorry, let me interrupt for a little bit to have some real talk. I create these videos for free because I strongly believe that knowledge should be accessible to anyone around the world. However, the ad revenue I get from YouTube is not nearly enough to sustain myself. If you want to help me make more videos in the future, then please consider joining my Patreon. You would also get a bunch of neat rewards in return to show how very much I appreciate your support. Alright, that's it. Sorry, back to the tutorial. Okay, so we talked about hue, saturation and value, or lightness. Nothing left anymore, right? Well, I want to briefly take a look at how it changes the parameters in another color space. This is HCL, which stands for Hue, Chroma and Lightness. The hue is pretty similar to the hue before, not quite the same, but close enough. Chroma is however quite different to saturation. It describes how colorful a color actually appears to us. For example, a hue red and a dark red would have the same saturation, but the chroma values would be very different because the hue red looks much more vibrant to us. And then the lightness is actually the perceptual lightness, so how bright a color actually appears to our human eyes. I described this color space in further detail in my color space tutorial. I want to mention that some of these colors aren't quite right. That's because certain chroma values aren't realistic. Here it goes from 0 to 100, but some hues can only reach a chroma way below 100. That has to do with how RGB works and our color perception. Therefore, some of these color gradients don't go from black to white, although they should. So these HCL graphs aren't super accurate, but they are good enough to show certain behaviors. Like for example, when some dark hues like blue are created, then we see some clear peaks. But what we can also see is that these curves are still always bent towards the upper right corner, regardless of what combinations of parameters I use. So this confirms that the darkening effect doesn't just happen mathematically, but also perceptually. By the way, I also find these graphs just fascinating to look at while they're scrolling through the colors in auto mode. Sort of mesmerizing. But yeah. The fact that the different hues look differently bright to us is still important. So in the end, trust your eyes. Look closely to check if the darkening effect of the multiply blending mode is actually satisfactory or not. The last one is the HCL Chroma. Now this one gets especially crazy. Again, the higher chroma values are mostly inaccurate, so focus more on the lower left part of the graph. Here we can see similar effects as in the saturation graphs. If you combine opposite hues, then the chroma sharply drops. Interesting is the fact that even if you combine the same hue, the chroma is overall lower too. The curves are bent towards the lower left corner, sure. But if you read where, for example, the 0.2 curve is in relation to the axis, then you can see that it was shifted outwards. That is because, as I mentioned before, if you darken a color, the vibrancy of the color will usually go down. For some brighter colors I am able to get higher chroma results though. Like here at 70% perceptual lightness for both. If we combine 0.4 chroma on both sides, we get 0.6 as a result. All of this is quite a whole lot more unpredictable, and formulating a clear rule out of this is very difficult. But that in itself can be a lesson here. Not only should you use your eyes to check your brightness contrasts, but also your color contrasts, how vibrant the colors are in relation to each other. Alright, we are done with the graphs and learned a couple of things through them. It is time to apply what we have learned. I made a simple drawing of my little mascot with many layers of kimonos. Just because I needed a design with lots of different colors combined, and this is what came to mind. I prepared 5 different color versions that have overall different saturation, lightness and hue variations. Let's start with the pastel version. So the colors are very bright, close to white. In my layers I have a lot of different effects that make use of the blending modes. One of the first things I like to do is to add some textures. Multiply can be a good way for adding those. You need to be careful though, since it overall darkens your image. For something like a paper texture that is mostly white, it is fine. Other textures though, maybe not so much. There are some blending modes that are better suited for those, like the light modes. Then the next step usually is adding some subtle gradients to the flat colors. Here I use some fill layers and clip them to the blending layers so that I can easily change the color with the color picker by using the object tool in Clip Studio Paint. By the way, it's fine if you're not using this program. The blending modes work pretty much the same across all of them. Now here we can see that if I use very strong colors, the gradient colors are very dominant. That's because the base colors are so close to white. I'm gonna tone it down a lot therefore and stick to a color that is also quite bright. You can cycle through the different hues to see what fits. Here I wanna go for some warmer tones. Next up the shadows. I drew them in a cel shaded style with a little bit of hatching for more texture. Here it is even clearer that if you choose a highly vibrant color, it's going to overpower everything. Now I'm not saying that this cannot work. A lot of this depends on what kind of style and effect you want to achieve. I am just showing you how these colors affect each other and make my own personal choices. And I would like to go for a softer look to fit the pastel vibe. Now I also have a couple of layers that use different blending modes, like screen. And they are supposed to brighten the colors, like lighting effects, sparkles and the like. Multiply is not suited for that, but in separate videos I'll explain those other blending modes too. And by the way, I also like to give the outlines a little bit of color. This will soften the contrast a bit further. Here's another layer that utilizes multiply, the vignette, which is basically just a round gradient along the edges of the canvas. Normally you would just use black and lower the opacity, but you could mix in some color too and use the multiplied blending mode to achieve the darkening effect. For the style of this drawing, I once again go for a warm and bright color to make the vignette quite subtle. Multiply can also be useful for adding your tag, if you place it at a relatively bright spot, that is. I usually try to blend the name tag into the artwork, at least a little bit. Lastly, I turn on this color mode layer to unify the colors a bit more. And with that, it is done. And once again without and with the blending layers. Quite a difference, wouldn't you say? And since I have everything on separate layers, changing the colors is very quick and easy. The next one uses neutral colors, so colors that are very close to gray. That also means that the colors have all three RGB values somewhat balanced. Therefore, if you choose a very vibrant color on the multiply layer, it will overpower the grays and tint everything in that exact hue. Can also be an interesting style choice. Lots of different colors work here. That's the nice thing about neutral colors. They can coexist with pretty much any color. I'm only demonstrating this with the shadow layer. No need to go through every single layer again, I'd only repeat myself. Alright, the next one is gonna get interesting, because I used super vibrant colors here. Colors that are very close to the hue colors. You can also call them neon colors. The version with the flat colors doesn't look very good in my opinion. I tried my best, while also making sure that I use many different colors. However, I actually quite like how it looks with the blending layers. And if you scroll through the layers, you can see that I actually used a lot of highly saturated colors for the blending layers too. You have seen in the graphs how crazy it can get if you combine two neon colors. This required a lot of trial and error. I gave myself the challenge to use mostly vibrant colors. Now, I did not go super crazy. The shadows, for example, are not quite fully neon. I could, however, and it still looks alright. Well, the shadows on the fan turn black, but you could still deem this acceptable. However, this is a delicate balance point. If I shift it a bit too much towards marine blue, the green pattern turns black. And if I shift too much towards cyan, then the green pattern basically doesn't get darkened at all. And depending on your mix of colors, such a balance point might not even exist. So you have to stay away from the hue colors. But still, using colors that are quite vibrant makes this picture look far better. As a matter of fact, if I used some kind of neutral color for the shadows, it would look a whole lot more boring. So yeah, if you use neon colors, it will most likely require a lot of experimentation. But the results can look super colorful and fun. Alright, the next one used a bunch of highly saturated dark colors. The flat color version has barely any contrast, and that's on purpose. The contrast will be added through the blending layers. As you can see, I made the shadows all super dark, and the highlights bring in the contrasts. Sort of ghostly looking even. The underlying colors are quite dark, but also strongly saturated, so they can still show some hard to predict RGB effects. For example, if I use a highly saturated green, the pattern on the kimono suddenly looks much brighter compared to the blue. And look at the kimono colors, the contrasts get jumbled around all over the place. So dark colors that are highly saturated are also a bit difficult to work with if you want to combine them with vibrant colors on your blending layers. It's not just the neon colors that can cause some problems. Lastly, at least for this drawing, a version that has a mix of vibrant and neutral colors with various brightnesses. The version with the other layers looks quite pleasant. However, most colors I used were not super vibrant. We're gonna take a look at the shadows again. The colors are around a safe middle point on cyan. I could go for high saturation and it would still work somewhat okay, but other hues create some crazy results, especially those on the opposite side of the cyan. While I shift through these, pay close attention to the yellow patterns and the brighter kimono layers. Starting at yellow, we get some strong greens. Red eliminated the cyans that are on the opposite side, while tinting the pattern a vibrant red. And the magentas and purples tint the kimono layers blue now. The blue to cyan hues work here because they are adjacent enough for the kimono layers. Since the yellow is so bright, it easily picks up any color from the blending layers, as we just saw. If it gets tinted towards a color that fits in well with the surrounding colors, that is the blue-greens of the kimono layers, then it works fine. Other hues, however, not so much, at least not if you crank up the saturation super high. So then, as you can see, working with multiply blending modes can work with any underlying colors, but you need to find the optimal color. There is no all-round color that you can use for everything. If you use neutral colors, they might look too bland. If you use very vibrant colors, they might create some unwanted RGB effects, ruining your contrasts. In these examples, I used one specific color for all the shadows. In some of my other works, however, I used different colors for different parts of the subject. In this piece, for example, I used a dark blue for the clothing, but a purple for the skin, so that the skin doesn't end up too pale looking. And the golden parts of her accessories used sort of a brown color even. And by the way, I have my eyedropper tool set up so that it only picks up the color of the currently selected layer. Useful if you're working with several blending layers. Also, these shadows are not cel shaded but painted, they have transparency too. So I often use dark colors on my multiply blending layer and use brushes that are not too opaque so that I still have control over the contrasts. I like painting that way because I don't need to constantly switch colors when I work on the shading for the clothing, for example. Instead, I just switch between painting and erasing, and as much tool if needed. That's it. As you can see, I used many layers with various blending modes. All of these and more will be explained in their own tutorial videos. By the way, the blending modes are not just limited to layers and filters. Various drawing tools can also make use of them. Back here in Clip Studio Paint, I'm using this rather soft yet opaque brush and set it to multiply now. Since I'm painting on top of white, or to be more precise, on top of transparency now, I only get the color I chose. But when I lift the pen and start drawing again, it now paints on top of the already existing green, therefore making the color darker. But if I paint outside of the shape, I still get the initial color. And you can repeat this so many times until you are just left with black. And this method has its pros and cons. It's convenient to not have to constantly switch colors and layers, but correcting some shapes this way is not really viable. You can't go back to brighten colors again with that brush. So I'd say it is useful in combination with other tools that let you pick up those individual colors for fine adjustments. So here I have some doodles that I made for a beginner's tutorial about how to draw red foxes. I didn't color them, but how about we do that digitally? Using the multiply blending mode makes this actually super easy. Just create a multiply layer above the photo, choose a somewhat soft brush, and paint with your colors. Here I'm adding some orange. The dark lines in the texture still get preserved. And on top of that, you could create another multiply layer and add some shading. For that purpose, I use an even softer, sort of smudgy brush. This can be a nice way to do some coloring if you feel more comfortable to do the line work traditionally. Or perhaps you just don't have access to traditional colors at the moment. Depending on the medium, they can be a bit expensive after all. If your lines are a bit too faint and you want to darken them, you can do so with correction layers, like the tone curve between the color layers and the original photo. Just find out where on this line the line's brightness is and lower it a little, while leaving the other values mostly the same. Now you could also do that in the multiply blending mode. That way you basically only darken. So for the brighter values and the very dark values, I push the curve up high so that they don't get changed too much. And around the middle the curve gets a dent to darken the lines. Now there is not that big of an advantage to using the tone curve in multiply mode, but perhaps you prefer it this way. I personally would recommend the brightness mode, also called luminosity, because it doesn't mess too much with the saturation. Again, more about that one in another video. Now this color technique works well if you leave the areas white to paint them in. However, if you already have your values and contrasts established, then the multiply layer will make everything even darker and ruin your contrasts. For that purpose, the color mode is more useful. Alright, let's move on to something different. This video, after all, is supposed to not just be for digital artists, but also for mixed artists, photographers, and so on. For normal photo editing it can also be used, of course. Here I'm using Photoshop now, just to mix it up a little. It works the exact same as in Clip Studio Paint or any other graphics program. For example, you could add a nice looking vignette effect, like before. Adjust the opacity to fine-tune it. Or perhaps your photo is overall too bright. In that case, you could darken everything by duplicating the photo, setting the upper one to multiply, and adjusting the opacity. Or you could achieve the same effect with a correction layer set to multiply. That way you would have some additional control, and also the project would require less space, since you don't have a large photo twice in there. Another thing I tend to do is adding some text backgrounds as multiply layers. Like here, for example, to add the names of my late cats. Those backgrounds make everything dark enough so that the text can be easily read while also still showing the photo underneath. It looks more colorful this way than just using a normal layer and lowering the opacity. Another thing you can do is create a fill layer, pick a bright color and set it to multiply. Everything gets darkened, not surprisingly. But also the colors are getting shifted towards the color you chose. Those are the most useful examples that I was able to think of. If there are any other techniques that you think would be good to know, then please let me and everyone else know in the comments down below. And if you liked this video, then there are lots of others coming up. Basically every single blending mode of default Photoshop gets its own video. There will also be comparison videos, like for example a video that compares multiply with color burn, linear burn and darken. All of those make the colors darker, but in different ways. Well then, I really appreciate you watching this video all the way to the end, and I hope it was helpful to you. Alright then, see you next time.